Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Braden James Mergard. I am serving as the CEO of Stakeholder-Centered Coaching, and I will be your host today. And wow, this is already turning out to be a wonderful turnout of attendees. As we get started, would you just go to the chat box? Everyone knows where your chat box is. Go to the chat box. Let us know where you're calling from. Go ahead and give us a city and a country. State if you're also in the United States. It'd be wonderful to get a quick poll on where everybody is coming from. And we are already seeing Germany, Netherlands, India, Malaysia, Bulgaria, Portugal, Philadelphia, PA. Wow, there are a lot of Hungary, Wales. We've got Missouri. We have friends calling in from Taiwan, Texas, Trinidad and Tobago. We've got some language I can't quite read, but ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being here today. We have a world-class panel that will be joining us. And I'd like to take a moment to introduce you to them all, because these will be our speakers. These will be the people giving us answers to the most pressing questions about leading remotely. So without further ado, let me begin by introducing our friend, David Monroe Jones. Hello, David. David is calling in from the UK. David is a stakeholder-centered coach. He's also a mentor and is certified in several world-class leadership methodologies. David also runs his own coaching practice, Perceptual Reality, which you can find online and look into more. Thank you for being with us, David. We look forward to some of your answers to the questions. We are also joined by Kimberly Gonzalez. Hello, Kimberly. Thank you for calling in. It's good to see you as well. Kimberly is calling in from the US. She is a PCC certified coach with ICF. She's also stakeholder-centered coaching certified and is a trainer. Kimberly runs her own practice called Leadership State, and she has 10 years of corporate banking experience and another 10 years of teaching communication and relation skills. So her input will be invaluable. Thank you for joining us, Kimberly. We're also joined by my friend Sunil. Sunil, there we are. Hello, Sunil. Sunil Deshmukh. He is calling in from India. Sunil is a leadership coach and also has extensive C-suite executive experience. So we're interested very much so to hear your perspective on both sides of this coin. Sunil has spent about 30 years in various senior management roles, ranging from CEO, CFO, and has worked across Africa, Asia, the Middle East. It's a wonderful profile. He's currently the independent director and on the board of listed companies and tech startups. And he has trained and mentored 150 professionals just since 2020 alone. So thank you for joining us, Sunil. Always good to have you. We're also joined by Raymond Cho. Hello, Raymond. Raymond is calling us. There we are. Hello, Raymond. Raymond is calling in from Malaysia, and Raymond is our serial entrepreneur. He has founded and co-founded several multi-million-dollar companies over the last 26 years, all around the APAC region. And he's currently growing his lifestyle chain of restaurants. He serves as the chief growth officer of an education and investment company, and also speaks publicly on topics such as leadership. So Ray, thank you so much for joining us. And finally, we have Vijay. Vijay, thank you for joining us here. Vijay Triathai. He is from the UAE and Malaysia and is a tech startup evangelist. I love that title, a tech startup evangelist. He has been he's the managing director at Techstars, which is a venture capital firm, and he's a frequent speaker at signature conferences to talk about everything from early stage startup investments, entrepreneurship. Vijay also hosts a weekly webcast show and volunteers to help mentor leaders, which is just wonderful. Of course, he's always on the move, given his role, and is traveling. I think, Vijay, correct me if I'm wrong, I think you're in Spain right now, is that correct?
That's correct, in Ibiza, exactly.
In Ibiza, love it. Yes, many of us are rooted firmly in our homes and are making this whole work from home situation work while you are still out there chugging along. We love it. And I think that your perspective on how we lead and manage remotely will become invaluable. So thank you for joining us here. Ladies and gentlemen, feel free to welcome our group, our panelists in the chat box. And this is a good time to point out a couple of the features of the session. First, we have our chat box, and I see that many of you already know how to make great use of that. Again, please feel free to welcome our guests there. We also have a Q&A function. So if everyone, I'll draw your attention to the bottom of the screen, you should see a little button that says Q&A. This is a good place to put specific questions. Of course, you can drop them in the chat box, but there is always a chance that they will get lost with other comments. So if you have specific questions you'd like answered, please drop them directly into the Q&A box, and we'll track these as best we can. Now, as you can imagine, we're scheduled for about 90 minutes. We've got five panelists, and we also have one more who I'm about to introduce. The time will be tight, and we want to cover as much ground as possible, but here's my promise to you. Any question that you ask today, whether it is in the chat box, whether it is in the Q&A box, they will be answered. Now, we may not be able to answer all of them here live today, but we will absolutely be going through all of the comments that have been put in and making sure that everyone in the coming weeks will receive a response to your question, because that's why we're here today, to learn about leading and managing remotely. And if you have any questions, we strongly encourage you to ask them, because we will be touching base both ourselves with the questions and with the panelists. So, and I also see someone calling in from not far from where I am in Oregon. Hello, Shelby. I am calling in from the Northwest on the Columbia River. I'm on the Washington State side of things. And just 2 states below me is our final panelist, Mr. Christopher Coffey. Chris Coffey. There we are. Chris, it is always good to see you. Chris is my friend. Chris is the co-founder of Stakeholder-Centered Coaching. He and I work very closely together on coaching projects, on training. Chris has coached hundreds of leaders, and his profile more than speaks for itself. He's been working with Marshall Goldsmith for many years, co-founded Stakeholder-Centered Coaching with Frank Wagner and Marshall Goldsmith, and has just been climbing the ladder ever since. Chris, it is so good to have you. Thank you for being here.
Good morning, everyone.
Wonderful. Well, ladies and gentlemen, as we said, we've got about 90 minutes scheduled for the session today, and I'm going to just jump right in if everyone's okay with that. Let's do this. As we do the introduction, please go to your Q&A box. I imagine that many of you came with questions already preloaded in your head. In order that we're all able to focus on what our speakers are going to present, let's do a quick brain dump in the Q&A box. Drop whatever questions are currently tickling the back of your brain. Let's get them on the file, and we'll get them in our pipeline to answer as much as we can. But we've got a few questions that we're going to jump right into. So, setting the stage for today's meeting. We are in 2022. We're coming off of a tumultuous 2 years, and in any crisis, it can be exceedingly difficult as a leader in an organization to take a breather, take a step back, and recognize when you've taken your eye off the ball, and we may even begin to hurt ourselves, maybe even hurting our team with some behaviors. Well, with the big transition that many of us have taken to working remotely, and many of us leading and managing remotely, that many of us have had to either adopt or possibly even prefer from the last 2 years, there's good sides and there's bad sides. And today we're here to talk about how to avoid the bad sides so that you can make the best of the good sides. So there's a number of negative practices that managers can succumb to. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So I'm going to open up with a nice simple question. Which is, how over the past 2 years did this transition to remote working transform the way that you have managed teams, or that you have managed and led coaching sessions? And if I may, I want to pick up with Ray. Ray, if you'd be willing to speak first on this, how has this transition to remote working affected your leadership, affected your management?
Hey, Brandon. Well, it definitely caused us to think a lot faster, right? It caused us to be a lot more innovative. And I think the key word that we learned throughout the last 2 years was the whole new way of engagement. I think a lot of the things that we used to do, being able to just get up from our chairs and just speak to somebody across the room, with regards to leadership, it was simple in that sense, right? But leadership is tough when you have to lead somebody which you can't really touch and feel, and it's not next to you. You've got to schedule leadership, right? Now we've got to schedule leadership to talk to somebody. We can't just talk to somebody at whatever time that we want. So, and it wasn't something that we just did once and we continued, right? It had to be something that we actually changed, like probably 3 to 4 times over the last 2 years. So I guess to sum it up, I think was leadership in the last 2 years was really about the speed of change. And we really just had to innovate and re-innovate and re-innovate 3 to 4 times throughout the last 2 years.
Yeah, that's challenging. Having people, like you said, not physically there. I'm a hugger. I very much enjoy hugging, and especially in celebrations. And it's kind of tough to do just the digital high five as best as we can get. Thank you for that perspective, Ray. And Vijay, I'd love to come to you as well. How has this affected you as you've been traveling? Has this affected you? And how has your leadership changed as a result of it?
I love the question. It's great. And thank you once again for me to be here. I think the idea of remote working, at least in the industry that I've been involved with, which is investing in early stage technology companies, did not really make a dramatic appearance on the onslaught of the pandemic, only because we've been, as a business model, decentralized and distributed around the world. We have 250 people managing a portfolio of 3,000 companies across the world. And so the idea of working remote is not a novelty. But what has changed is, to Raymond's point, the frequency of us meeting in person has diminished dramatically. And we've suddenly realized that we can be far more productive in scheduling 10 to 15 Zoom calls in a day, as opposed to having 2 or 3 meetings over coffee. And so that was one tremendous discovery between the people we work with in terms of productivity. The second, in terms of leadership, I think it's just the way that we engage. Typically, it tends to be more top-down, instructive. You go to meetings, you say, okay, what is the strategy and what we set as targets? That seems to be less of importance today. The idea of leadership in that sense has evolved to, having quick daily, if not weekly, stand-ups virtually, and basically having a largely collaborative and participation among the community, whether it's the internal, external teams, using tools such as, spreadsheets to CRM, as well as Slack, to have the continuous, seamless, 24/7 communications. So you really don't need these physical meetings to basically try to establish at a point in the journey of a company to establish these are the targets, and these are the objectives to be done. So that the purpose of the meeting today, and I've been traveling for the past 2 months across the world, largely is to build relationships. And that relationships, is often done in remote locations. I'm currently in Ibiza in Spain with a group. And the whole idea is just to bond and build those relationships. But in terms of leadership, I'm trying to give instructions in direction to where the company's heading and building that North Star. It seems to be working seamlessly on a virtual experience. The last thing I'd like to just add that I think, leadership is not one individual. It's really about the coming together of multiple individuals who have what I would define as superhuman talents, and they shine at different occasions on different situations across their journey. And therefore, you have to allow leadership to be so-called immersive with multiple participation in the process.
So it sounds like this sounds like you're still able to physically meet up with some of these teams from time to time. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think the physical aspect is still important. I think, just to check in, to have visual contact, to have the emotional bond, that's necessary. But if you're tracking what I call hard data, you're checking for performance, you don't necessarily need to do that in a physical sense. You really need to establish clear OKRs, clear KPIs for the company to perform in the direction that you're seeking for. But the in-person meeting is really about collaborative, creative process of thinking of problem solving, creative process of coming up with new ideas, but also the relationship.
Fascinating. Thank you for that perspective. And I'd love to also hear from coaches, from one of our coaches. How has this transition to people working remotely and communicating from much farther distances affected the way that you're coaching? And I'll remind our panelists, you have your raise hand button at the bottom of your screen as well. I'll encourage you to use that if and where possible, and we'll come around as time allows. But I'll kick off here with Kimberly. I see your hand. How has this affected the way that you coach, and how have you seen this affect the way that the leaders you're coaching are managing?
Thank you, Brandon. It's a great question. Part of what I've been really conscious of, having worked remotely for a very long time, what's been different over the last few years is really making time with leaders that I'm coaching just to ground them in a moment of pause and taking a breath. I think all of us have been running at a speed, as Vijay and Ray spoke to, that's very fast, requiring constant change. And so mindfulness is something I bring into my work with leaders, and just helping them to slow down so they can connect to themselves. And that really helps relationship.
So it's about the slowing down and taking stock before you actually are meeting with the team or leading others. That seems to be the difference maker for you.
Taking a pause, right? Work is moving very, very fast. We still need to come from a grounded, centered place to be our best. And that takes a mindful moment.
Wonderful. Thank you, Kimberly. We'll have time. I'm just going to come to David very briefly because I want to hear your perspective, and we're going to move on because the next piece, we're going to reveal a little bit of the armchair research that we've done on this particular topic. David, what's your opinion here?
Yeah, I agree with everything that's been said. And I think that part of it is the recognition that once we started to move to working remotely, it was a behavioral change. It was what we were doing today is different to what we're going to be doing tomorrow. And certainly, so like from a coaching perspective, leaders needed to recognize that that was the case, not just for themselves, but for their teams as well. So as Kimberly was saying, that ability to, just take stock, but then move into action and say, right, okay, well, what are we going to do differently? What needs to happen? And look at it from all the different perspectives were some of the key things and some of the key changes that were very apparent.
Thank you, David. It seems that there's some very strong themes that are coming up as our panelists are sharing their input. I want to take a minute now to share. We've done our own digging, and we'll bring this up on screen here in a moment. But based on our research, we have identified the most common themes that have come up about the worst habits that are being displayed by remote leaders in this relatively new environment. For some of us have been doing this longer than others. But there are some very specific behaviors that have been called out by leaders that we ourselves as coaches or as leaders need to be aware of. And you can see these here on screen now. I'll read these out because I want them to crystallize in our mind. I want us to be able to walk away from this session. If there's one thing that you're walking away with, keep this in mind. These are the behaviors that leaders are displaying that really need to be avoided. And the first one is keeping your team in the dark during uncertain times, and also just lacking empathy. That might be neglecting team morale and company culture, having too much negativity, or even just prioritizing the wrong communications. This could be from just giving too much one-way download of information rather than having a dialogue, or just, we're seeing this sometimes in terms of people not having the hardware they need to maintain contact and communication and receive the leadership they need. We also have trying to identically take in the in-person work style into the new remote work environment. As we've heard, things have changed. Leadership needs to change. People have changed, their expectations have changed, and so does our leadership. And this might be a matter of not communicating when you're available, or even just being too transactional and neglecting the casual, as we heard earlier, making sure that you schedule leadership is a big thing. Otherwise, it becomes transactional. Another one is thinking that remote work somehow reduces performance as a default. And as a result, the reaction is applying too much pressure. We've seen this with companies who would rather measure how long a person is sitting in their chair rather than what results they're being able to be produced from their role, or just handing off too much. We've also heard, this is a slight aside, but is within point number 3 here, is the dropping messages in Slack too often. We've heard Slack as and we've all seen Slack as a pretty critical tool. It could just be over communicating at times. We have not respecting your team's boundaries. That could be ignoring work-life balance. I mean, we've seen this as well with companies that insist cameras are on at all times, regardless of what's going on behind you, kids walking in, dogs barking, but just generally not respecting boundaries. And the last one is forgetting to manage yourself. When you're in a room and you are carrying some manner of authority, or people are looking at you, the body language changes that dynamic. And when you don't have that, sometimes we sort of forget to manage ourselves and remember that we are leading others and setting the example through our behaviors. So I think the key question I want to turn to our panelists now is, have you observed these, and what impact have you seen these behaviors have on people at work? And I'll start off here with, let's start off here with Vijay, if we can.
I was recently in Denver for a convention with the Texas community, and the first thing that I wasn't the first thing, I think maybe over a dozen times I was asked, "Oh, I didn't realize you're so tall." And that seems to be the theme for 3 days. And I think what it tells us is that it's actually a level playing field when everyone's on Zoom, as we are right now. And typically in a corporate setting, you'll have the CEO or the lead of the team having a bit more posturing with regards of the dressing style, or where he sits in the room or on the table. All that matters. But on Zoom, that equalizes the whole experience. And so I think the 5 things that you flagged out as mistakes, I would agree with you that I think this is I think a lot of leaders don't have the benefit of onboarding in terms of being a great leader virtually. And I think this came through trial and experience. As we now transition back to more of a hybrid model, I think people are gradually trying to find their footing in the process. I think I just want to add, in a way related to the points that was raised earlier and the remote, the mistakes that leaders make remotely. I think there's 2 specific elements that I've learned as a leader. One is, I think the essence of building trust is the fundamental, most important issue the leader can do it. It's far more difficult to do that on Zoom, of course. And I think having that one-on-one conversation with individuals in the team is essential to kind of bring that trust around. The second is that in the 24/7 world that we operate in, we spoke about this, it's really important not to be presumptions that everyone is okay. Frankly, everyone is not okay. And we really have to be mindful of mental health and the wellness and the well-being of individuals. So we need to basically, often as a leader, to do this, to take this question and say, and do a check-in. Are you okay? Is there something that can help you? Is there anything more? Because if you don't ask those questions, basically people will not rise to the occasion and say, I am facing a difficulty in my household, I'm facing difficulty with my teams. Because it's really hard to have that water cooler talk if you were, say, in the typical office settings. So I just want to bring those 2 points out because I think it's essential that that's where leaders should not turn a blind eye to in the process.
It's interesting that you talk about intentionality and trust, because we're seeing, as you're speaking, we're having a number of questions come in about how you lead meetings with trust, how you schedule this type of leadership, there's a lot of how-to questions ranging from being intentional to scheduling, as we heard earlier, scheduling leadership, and asking some of these hard-hitting questions that you're bringing up, Vijay. And I'd like to come to Sunil. Sunil, have you seen any of these behaviors in your work as a coach or as a leader, and what impact have they had?
Yeah, thanks, Brendan. I fully agree with what Vijay said, and I have physically seen when I started my coaching, it was in physical mode, and within 3 months or maybe 6 months, I had to switch on to the remote mode. So it itself was overwhelming for myself. But what I realized in all this process while coaching the leaders or while coaching even mid-level managers, most of the people or leaders whom I was coaching, they were typically digital immigrants, and they needed to convert themselves from a digital immigrants into a digital natives. And same is case with me. I'm a baby boomer. I'm not a Gen Z or a millennial. So problem with all these people where they were technically not knowing, even though he is a leader in the office or she is a leader in the office, they had a battery of people working around for them and managing their technology platforms and all those things. Now suddenly they have to manage on their own. So according to me, what has happened is a lack of self-efficacy for the managing remote teams has become a big issue according to me. And then they started micromanaging people, and rightly said by the Vijay, the trust issue. We have been taught how to trust someone in a physical mode, not on a virtual mode. So all these issues I have personally seen, and people were confused, leaders were confused, and they were all doing trial and error for first 6 months. That's what my observation. Thank you.
So Sunil, if I'm hearing correctly, it sounds earlier we talked about the issue of leaders demonstrating trust. It sounds also that the stakeholders are lacking trust the other direction, as you mentioned, because of we've been trained and programmed to trust physically, but not necessarily a two-dimensional representation of someone. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. That's absolutely correct. Thanks. Yep.
I'd love to spend some time in the Q&A given the questions that have come in. So I'll park this with our panelists to think about, which is really, how do you build that trust? We've heard intentionality. We've heard using mindful practices. We've heard about scheduling leadership. I'm curious how we can wrap all of this together and for our participants, give them concrete actions that they can take either as a manager today with their team, or that they can take as a coach to recommend to the leaders whom they are coaching. So these behaviors are important. Again, please take them on mind. I want to move to another question and direct this one towards Chris Coffey, because I know that you have experience here. You've coached hundreds of leaders, many in very complex situations. Ladies and gentlemen, if you haven't gotten the chance to hear some of Chris Coffey's stories, I oblige you to please follow up with him, connect with him on LinkedIn, ask some questions, because he has some truly eye-opening stories to share. Chris, my question for you is, as we look at these negative behaviors, it's obvious that some of these need to be eliminated. I think my question for you is going to be, how do people go about eliminating these, and how do they go about making the elimination of them visible in a world where we're really only communicating in scheduled meetings and typically speaking specifically about tasks? How does one go about eliminating these behaviors?
Well, I think that a quick answer to that is basically the stakeholder-centered coaching process helps facilitate that. But let me leave that aside for the moment. I've taken a lot of notes as I've listened to people talk, and I agree with what everybody has said. And you know, one of the things I'm known for is asking questions, and so I would say one of the things we as coaches and leaders in companies need to ask ourselves is, and I read over, you know, what you put up about managing yourself and doing all of this and the negative behaviors. And one of the things that drew me to right away is all of these, we as humans are creatures of habit. Whatever behaviors we have, whether it's in person or virtual, is our behavior and how we interact with people. And so perceptions of others is critical. We all know the expression, perception is reality, and all of that. All I would say is, in this virtual world, all of these negative behaviors can be multiplied and exacerbated. If you have a bad behavior and you can't walk down the hall and talk to somebody, it can grow. But my challenge to everybody would be, don't let remote be an excuse for not having appropriate behavior. Let me give you a simple example. I mean, I took lots of notes here about behavior. I worked with the division president of a Fortune 50 company before COVID. And in the 360, it became clear that his direct reports, all senior VPs, said that he was too remote personally, and that he was not a good coach and mentor to them. Now, these are senior vice presidents in a Fortune 50 company. So one of the things that we put into his action plan is he was going to have a 30-minute meeting monthly with each of his direct reports, and it was their agenda for him to talk, for them to talk to the president about where they wanted to go, not business meetings, just personally, be a good mentor to them. Now, I ask everybody on this call, could that be done virtually? You schedule a Zoom call with everybody once a month to build trust. This is what's important to you, and all of that. So I think, you know, looking at, you know, being concerned about people's schedules in this 24/7 world that we live in. I had one leader I was working with who was notorious for sending messages in the middle of the night. Now, I've been coaching remotely for 20 years because most of the leaders I've worked with have people spread all over the world. And so I would say, now you're sending a message to somebody and expecting a response at 4 a.m. their time. I mean, let's get real here. So to me, so much of this is becoming cognizant, like you said, number 5, you know, managing yourself. So much a part of coaching is helping leaders become much more aware of their own behavior and the impact it's having on others, whether that's remote. And most of the leaders I've been, and I agree with VJ right at the beginning where he said, it really hasn't been that much different because he manages remotely leading his companies. Most companies today, people are spread all over the place, as opposed to coming down the hall and going to a meeting in a conference room. So I would challenge all of us to not use remote as an excuse, and ask yourself, if we didn't have COVID, how would I have handled this situation? And then say, okay, given the fact that we're remote, how would I tweak that? Do I need to schedule a Zoom call? What do I need to do? And so the challenge becomes, and what I have found on a positive side of this, so many people, I live in Los Angeles, people got an hour commute to and from work. That's 2 hours a day that you just found by not having to go into work. So these are all challenges. Anyway, I don't want to go on any more than that. So any questions people have about that, you can put in the chat room. But one of the things I really want to emphasize is the perception of the stakeholders, the people that you interact with in your interdependent, but be they peers, colleagues, direct report, your immediate boss. Who do you interact with and who are you dependent on? How do they see you now? How do you want them to see you? Put a plan together and think about what you're going to do. Share it with them and periodically say, am I doing what I said I was going to do? It's not complex. It's challenging, but it's not rocket science or complex. The fact that I had a rocket scientist tell me, no, it's harder than rocket science.
That's wonderful. So Chris, it sounds like the recommendation is to, as you've said, benchmark, where am I at now? How do I want people to see me? What's the delta? How do I fill the gap? And then just go about doing it. Is it really that simple? I mean, surely there's got to be more to it than that.
It's simple. It's not easy. You know, look, losing weight is simple. We know what to do. It's difficult for anybody who's tried to lose weight and keep it off. It really does become, how are you seen now? How do you want to be seen? And are you willing to have the discipline to tell people what you want to be more effective at? Ask them for a couple of suggestions, build a plan, share it with them, and then measure how people see you 6 months later. Have you done what you said you were going to do? And now that builds trust. When we all talk about the importance of trust, and trust is built over time. Are you doing what you said you were going to do?
So setting up just a very small step to climb over to start building that trust. I want to come to Vijay, and then I want to come back to Kimberly on this. Vijay, I saw that you had your hand up. Are you
Yes.
Are you in agreement with this, and what's your reaction?
Yeah, thanks. I just want to jump in there and build on what Chris said. I think I used to say this, that trust but verify. But really now, there's a slight nuance to that, in the sense that you trust your team, but you need to, have the support in saying, how do we close on the non-performance gaps? So what can I do to help you close that? As opposed to, operating as a policeman or a law enforcement officer to check on performance. You're just saying, look, let's make this transparent as a process. Let's, as a team, update our self-update, self-report our performance. And if you're falling short of key metrics, then my role as a leader is to step in and say, how can I support to make you win? And that doesn't need to happen at the end of the period, which could be a quarter or half a year. It should be happening on a weekly or monthly basis, depending on what works best. And I think that's the nuance I like to add. The other thing that I think we should also put this in context. We cannot generalize the population that we're dealing with. Just recognize that you have the Gen Z, the millennium. You also have a lot of people traditionally working in an office environment. And this is a bit of a shock to the system for them. So understanding that there are different shades of the population that you need to deal with, there's no one size fit all approach. One needs to understand and take on and embrace the idea that you may have to have a hybrid versions of dealing with people. So those are 2 points I just want to add on.
Thank you, Vijay. And as you were talking and as Chris was talking, we got quite a number of comments. We seem to have stirred our audience a bit. And as we turn the mic to Kimberly, I'll say, I got a note from Sunil. I think everyone will appreciate. I might just print on a plaque for my wall. Trust comes on foot and leaves on horseback. Trust comes on foot and leaves on horseback. Love that. Thank you, Sunil. Kimberly, what's your response here?
Thank you.
Well, thank you. That's a great quote. And building on what Chris and Vijay had said, what strikes me is I notice that the leaders who are most able to build trust is because they have clear expectations, as Vijay spoke about, and again, with a process that teams agree to. Part of what builds trust is doing what we say we do, and communicating, what am I going to do? And then doing it and being able to agree together, have we done what we said we would? Instead of having some of the that Chris is working with, we've noticed that what really builds trust is having shared agreements around accountability. And as Vijay said, where we notice a gap, how can we hold one another accountable? Those are particular behaviors, right? And that's that blend of empathy and recognizing how much is going on for people and that constructive push forward, right? How are we going to improve and get a bit better? One of the bits of research that really stands out to me, and I think all of the leaders in the room and the coaches know this, that a big derailer for executives is that abrasive kind of behavior. That can take someone who's otherwise a rainmaker and very successful and really derail them. And so part of what we know is important is that people who feel respected and valued, it improves engagement, it improves retention, it improves commitment. And with the employees who feel respected and valued by their leaders, they're 56% more likely to stay with their organization. They're happier, they're healthier. So as Chris was saying, making these things behavioral it's worth avoiding some of these negative behaviors because the impacts on our teams, our colleagues, on our whole workforce is huge. And they are things we can do. We have a choice about how we show up and being able to use tools to change like we use with our leaders. Our daily sheet, I think, is, as Chris would say, the magic sauce. How do we help people keep new behaviors top of mind?
That reminds me of one of my favorite quotes from Alan Mulally when he was asked how he responded in 9/11, showing up as the CEO of Boeing. And he said, "It's showtime. I'm not paid for how I feel about things. I'm paid for how I behave and how I lead others." And that's really the number one thing that we can control. So I've got a question I want to open up to David and Sunil. Chris, perhaps you have a thought of this as well. And it comes down to what we talked about earlier. Chris, what you picked up for us is the role of stakeholders, the role of the people around us who really hold a stake in our performance as leaders. When we're thinking about this remote leadership, remote management, what are some of the best feed forward advices as a coach that you have heard or you have seen one of your clients receive? And we'll pick up with Sunil. The question is, what great feed forward suggestions have you seen or heard about being a remote leader and manager? Sunil, what are your thoughts?
Yep, thank you very much, Brandon. It's really a great question, and I had a fantastic story on this. That's why I raised my hand. So I was coaching this.
Sunil, you have gone on mute.
I'm sorry. So I was saying that, yeah, I have a great feed forward story or a real life example. So I was coaching this CEO of an American multinational company based out of Bangalore in India. And it was a stakeholder-centered coaching. I was giving it to him. And in one of the sessions, one of the stakeholders came to me and he told me that, we do the survey and all those things for the stakeholders. And he wanted to speak to me one-on-one rather than writing on a survey. And he said, just 5 minutes call. And he calls me and he says that, by the way, the leader whom you are coaching, he thinks that when he goes on a virtual meetings, he attains 2 to 3 technology. He starts meeting on 2 to 3 technological devices, one on his laptop, one on his desktop, one on his iPad. And he simultaneously tries to attend 2 or 3 meetings. And we are all confused to whom he's directing and to whom he's saying what. And he himself gets confused at the end of the meeting. And he asked me as a coach, can you please tell my boss to stop doing this thing? And I was like, wow, this is the best feed forward example I have seen in my life.
Wow.
I just wanted to share that.
That's amazing. Ladies and gentlemen, go to your chat box. I think it's horror story time. Go to your chat box. If you have seen or you have experienced, please keep this anonymous. Please don't don't call any names out, but if you have seen some just truly egregious behavior as a result of people working remotely, I have to imagine we have some colorful examples. But let me come to David, because I know you're also working with a diverse group of leaders. What feed-forward suggestions have you seen come through the pipeline that have been either particularly effective or that have been, as Sunil has shown us, particularly interesting?
Thanks, Brandon. I'll start with the ones that are particularly annoying for people, which is not making time because something else comes along, some sort of competing aspect. And it links back to the conversation about trust in so much as not just looking at trust as what you said you would do, but actually valuing the individual for who they are, what they've contributed. And within that, there's nothing worse than sitting on Zoom or Skype or whatever platform it is, waiting for something to happen, and nothing does. And I think from a more positive perspective, a lot of the people that I've been speaking to lately have said that once they engage, especially with the Marshall Goldsmith process, that the feed forward comes regularly, it comes often, they don't have to chase it. And that sort of engagement not only helps them to work on the behaviors that they've identified or that have been identified for them, but it also increases aspects of motivation. It starts to help them to feel valued within the organization. It gives them a little bit more commitment within that. And I think part of the process as well is really understanding what we mean by awareness, that it is the way that you're perceived by others, but also during that process that people understand how to give feed forward, but also that the people who are receiving the feed forward are accepting of that, because that's not always the case. And especially remotely, it's very easy to end a meeting and then just switch off and go in, do what you were doing. Whereas when we were in the workplace, if something seemed amiss, if you thought, what, perhaps I've said something that has been misinterpreted or they haven't quite understood that, you could go and chat to them. You could go and say, look, is everything okay? And within feed forward from a remote perspective, if you get that little alarm bell in your head saying, what, I'm not too sure whether that was communicated the way that I wanted it to be, that you go back to that individual. You don't just park it and leave it, that you do something about it.
Thank you for that, David. Before going to the next question, I want to come to Ray. I think Ray, I'd like to open the question to you, but also, you've talked about scheduling leadership, scheduling, making sure that there's time for this. And I think that's wonderful. I'll put a little bit of myself into the question, which is I also struggle with, when you're in person, it's quite easy for that casual follow-up, as David mentioned, right after the meeting, you just grab someone and, hey, can I follow up on this? But now it's a much more heavy procedure. Hey, we need to schedule a time. What's the agenda? What are we discussing? What do I need to prepare? Ray, given that you have multiple businesses in multiple locations, how have the question, of course, about feed forward, but also how do you solve an issue like this? What are your thoughts, Ray?
Hey, Brandon. I think so I've run hybrid environments for the last probably 15 years and multiple locations. I think that the pandemic gave it a name, right? In the past, it's just been, okay, we can't talk to each other, so we've got to just do everything on remote. But now there's a name to it. I think what worked for us is the concept of predictability. I think what doesn't work in a remote environment is mimicking what we were able to do in a physical environment into remote environment. So in a physical environment, we could just, like I said, get up from our chair, just go shout at somebody and say, hey, can I have your time? But obviously that can't happen in remote work. So predictability needs to happen. I think what worked for us is two things. One is rhythms, and the second is discipline. We have a morning call every morning at 9:08 a.m. Now, people always ask me why 9:08. For some reason, people either won't remember there's a 9 o'clock meeting, or people will come late to a 9 o'clock meeting. But people seem to be on time when it's a 9:08 a.m. meeting. Maybe because it's just weird. Who would schedule a meeting at 9:08 a.m.? During the pandemic, we actually added another rhythm, which is in the evening. So the morning rhythm was more of, okay, what do I need to do today? What do I need to achieve? Who do I need to work with during the day? Then everyone can just take their one-on-one calls across the day. The evening calls are more which happens at 5:42 p.m. It's more of a, how are you call? How have you been throughout the day? It's a more lighter call to end the day. And that worked for us many years before the pandemic, and that worked for us through the pandemic as well. So I guess having that clarity of vision, the predictability, the agendas are always fixed. I feel that is needed. I believe that in the pandemic, more, or rather in the whole remote working environment, more communication is needed than less.
I like that. So 9:08 meetings and 5:42 meetings. Did I hear that correctly?
Absolutely. Nobody will ever be late.
Oh, I think that's wonderful. That may be something we start trying. So ladies and gentlemen, there's one of your key takeaways. Meetings at 9:08, meetings at 5:42. Before going to the next question, if I could see just our panelists by show of thumbs up or thumbs down, we see a lot of companies having, let's call it happy hour, where they come together and everyone just have a drink from your home, get on Zoom. And that's how they stay connected. That's how they kind of bridge the gap between being physically together and remote. Is that enough? My question for you is that enough? We see this as a fairly common practice. Is it enough that people come together for 1 hour once a week, have a drink, have a cocktail or a coffee, and just connect personally? Is that enough to maintain good relationships and build trust? Panelists by show of thumbs. Yeah, okay, so pretty ubiquitous answer, unanimous answer rather. Okay, just wanted to take the temperature on that, because it is a practice we're seeing more and more, and it was unfortunately something that was more common than not. So then let's turn to another question I have for Chris. And ladies and gentlemen, I encourage you, go to your chat box, go to the Q&A box, drop your questions, because we're going to transition to Q&A here in just a moment. This question first is going to come to I'll actually open this up to our panel, but Chris, I'd like to have you to have the final word on this one, which is ultimately, what are the solutions to, or perhaps what are the tips that you can provide to give, to reinforce appropriate behaviors? We talked about this leader who's jumping on from multiple channels. We've heard some other negative stories in our chat box. What can we do as leaders or as managers to reinforce the appropriate behaviors and also negatively reinforce the negative ones? What can we do about this?
Well, let's go with I think it was Sunil who brought up the one, the leader who was on multiple screens at the same time. Now, let's say if I was working with that leader and I get a call from one of his stakeholders who says to me, well, he's doing this, can you ask him to stop? My question would be, I could. But why don't you? You're a stakeholder. Now, if the stakeholder centered coaching process has been set up correctly and everybody understands feed forward, and let's say this particular leader's created an action plan from suggestions, and certainly there's going to be comments in the 360 about him being distracted, I would think, and not staying focused on what's going on. And hopefully something would have been built into the action plan about staying focused. Well, they get on 3 cameras, somebody coming back. And again, if the leader has said, through this process, I want to become more effective at collaborating, and periodically has said, that I'm working on this, if you notice the difference, or the stakeholder comes back and they've been deputized from the beginning to comment on the action plan, It just seems to me that that individual, I would say to that individual, well, let's talk about you. Now, if that person's afraid to go to their manager and say, you know, I find it very distracting when you do this, and I've talked to others who also do, you know, I would suggest that you don't have 3 monitors and go into 3 meetings at the same time. Now, if you can't do that, I don't know how you build trust. I don't know how you do it. And we talk about coaching and we talk about courage, discipline, humility. Courage is being able to say, I want to become more effective at XYZ. The discipline is to take the suggestions you've been given, build an action plan and share it with people. And then periodically on a monthly basis, just walking down the hall or at the end of a Zoom call, say, you know that I'm working on this. Have you noticed the difference? I mean, that's the process. And I'm a little bit warped because whether it's remote, and I think it's magnified if it's remote, but I just find too many leaders making excuses for things because it's remote. And if you say, okay, well, if you were in the office, how would you do it? Well, I'd walk down the hall. Well, that's if they're in the office and they're there at the same time. But let's say I'm in LA and the person I'm talking about is in San Francisco. That's remote. Even if they're in an office in San Francisco. What do you do? So again, it's really, and it's taken these negative behaviors, just like Marshall's unrecognizable habits, winning too much, adding too much value, passing judgment, making excuses. I always have people say, what would be the opposite of that? What's the opposite of winning too much? Well, the opposite of winning too much could be phrased as share the credit. So again, this is the skill the coach brings to an engagement. You have to have a leader that you're working with that has the courage, the discipline, and the humility to say, as good as I am, these are a couple of things I want to become more effective at. I'm interested in your suggestions on how I could do it. Then you build a plan, you share it with them, and you make sure that they're following through with the plan. That's part of the daily sheet, as Kimberly had mentioned, the monthly follow-up with people. So much of our work in coaching is getting other people to recognize and acknowledge how their behavior is impacting others. It really is, and whether it's remote, and I agree that remote can compound all of this. My challenge is don't let it become an excuse for poor management and poor leadership.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, what Chris is talking about here is very much the stakeholder-centered coaching methodology. There'll be a link that may come through the chat box where you can hear more about this, or perhaps see examples. I think is much more articulate, is that we'll be able to, you can see examples of what this looks like, what the outcomes are, and the deliverables of how people are working on exactly what Chris just talked about. So with that, I want to make sure that we have about at least 15 minutes to talk about the questions our participants have brought in. We've got 12 pending questions in our Q&A box, and I'm going to get through these as much as possible. I'll ask our panelists, try to keep responses, 2 minutes or less, so that way we can cover as much topics, as much ground as possible. And I wanted to start off with one that came through for Kimberly. I'm looking for the specific question. Kimberly, if you'll go ahead and come up, the gist of the question was, when you take a breather, when you take that moment and you have that moment of mindfulness, do you find that that time is being used on more productivity for project, task, operations, or is it actually being used for leadership? What has been your experience?
It's a great question. Thank you for that question. I see it as both and, right? First thing about leadership is being able to manage ourselves. And that's what some of the habits spoke to. I think once we're able to resettle our central nervous system and take that moment of pause, then we move into what's important now. And sometimes that is just a matter of retaining our focus And as Chris has said, and Jay and others have alluded to, it's doing the things that need to be done. So that mindfulness can work to both help us relationally, but also help us get the results, because they're both important.
Thank you, Kimberly. I want to come to, I'm going to throw out a pretty big question. I think we all have a fairly strong opinion and probably a laundry list of responses to this, but I'm going to limit us to 2 responses. This question came from Paul Epping. Here's his proposition: trust is the currency of the future. Trust is the currency of the future. Do you agree with this statement? So again, I'll open this up to all our panelists. Maximum, we'll have 2 responses. I see Sunil in agreement. So Sunil, if I can call on you first, come on up to the front and tell us, do you agree that trust is the currency of the future?
Brendan, I 100% agree. Trust is the currency of future. I would say trust is the cryptocurrency of the future. It should multiply in a blockchain fashion world over to amongst all the leaders. Thank you.
That's wonderful. Let's ping over to Ray. Ray, if you would respond to this, given your role, do you agree or disagree with the proposition that trust is the currency of the future?
I think trust is one of the currencies of the future. I think it needs to evolve. I don't think that whatever that we're experiencing now with regards to remote work is going to be the same even next year. I think as technology catches up with us, we're going to see new forms of how this is all being done. Through the pandemic, we also through the whole remote working environment, we've also explored different types of platforms, right? Platforms where we could create virtual offices to mimic our office, but in a virtual world. We're going to be seeing the metaverse come into the picture in a couple of years. And when that comes in, everyone will have some form of an avatar going into the work environment. And that's going to be very different. That's going to be a physical environment in a virtual environment. It's going to confuse the hell out of everybody, right? So trust is although it's a foundation, but the way that we create the trust, I just feel it's just going to be different. And I don't know what it's going to be like.
Well, that's a good segue to some of our other questions. And I want to focus specifically on our coaches for this. So Kimberly, Sunil, Dave, and Chris. How can leaders be coached to trust their stakeholders more when they may have some subconscious fear that in that remote world, they're losing control of their team? How can leaders be coached to trust their stakeholders more? Chris.
Well, before you can trust the stakeholders, I think, the stakeholders have to trust you. I mean, and you said, is trust the currency of the future? I would say trust is the currency. Forget the future. Trust always has been in the past, the present, and the future. Key. If you can't trust the person that's leading you, whether you're their parent or whatever, and integrity. I would add integrity to it. Now, what does integrity mean? The person knows that what you say is your bond. That is what you will do. And trust, I will tell you how I see trust violated all the time. Managers and leaders wanting to be liked and giving people information about their career and what's going on and not giving honest feedback to people where they are underperforming and where they're not going to be ready for the next promotion. And they'll sugarcoat it and tell people things. That's cruel. That's not trust. So when somebody says, look, if you're going to talk to Chris Coffey, he's going to give you a difficult message because of the performance that, the level that you just created. It'll be honest. It'll be heartfelt. The key is if the stakeholders, the direct reports, the peers around you see you, they judge you're trying to help them accomplish their goals, and you will be honest and you will be candid. You build trust. You sugarcoat it and you don't do it. People say, well, they tell everybody that they're terrific. They give everybody positive feedback. You can't really trust what they say because they're going to tell you you're wonderful. But behind your back, they're going to say he's not ready for the next position. So trust and integrity are integral to everything. Now, so the leader has, stakeholders, the people you work with have to see you at that level. Then you have to be able to, how do you trust them? What are the key performance indicators? What are they responsible to deliver? I mean, that's how trust gets created. So for instance, I know if my business partner tells me something, I know I can count on it. And if there's a problem, he's going to get to me and say, Chris, you know, what I told you last week, you know, we've run into a little bit of a roadblock. Do you trust the people around you, your direct reports, if they run into a problem that you agreed that they're responsible to deliver to you, and they see it going off track because of unexpected influences, unintended consequences, will they come forward and say, we're running into a problem in a timely manner? Or do they hold on to it and not get to you because they're frightened? I mean, these are all, whether it's remote or whether it's live, are critical. They're critical. So we talk, you know, there's some basic things in the world that you have to have trust. People have to be able to count on your word. So if a direct report says, I will have that on your desk Monday morning, you can sleep over the weekend. Now, if the last 5 times they've told you that, Monday morning they come up with an excuse as to why it wasn't done, how well can you trust them on Friday when they tell you it'll be there Monday? Trust is doing what you say you're going to do and delivering. I don't know how to make it any simpler than that.
Well, you gave a good advice earlier about just making that trust hurdle very low and doing it repeatedly, consistently over time. And that really drives the point with the stakeholders. So Kimberly, let's turn over to you and hear your thoughts on this.
Thank you. And I'm playing off of this and also a question that I happen to see in the chat with regard to how a leader can trust stakeholders. I do agree with what Chris said, right? The very act of leadership is I go first. I make it safe for you because I'm honest, I'm kind, right? And that means telling the truth, but with respect and holding you in high regard. And you can count on me. The other thing that I think is really important about this framework, and we've spoken about, right, coaching is part of effective leadership. Everyone needs a coach, but access, our methodology brings a level of accessibility to people who might otherwise be left out of a leader's orbit. And I think that's a key part of people feeling trusted, is to know, like, yes, I have a CEO and I may be far down the chain, but in my organization, my voice is heard. Who I am is recognized and valued, right? That's about respect. And so we can't just say the right things and create trust. It has to follow from our actions. As Chris says, what can we see? Behavior. You can't see my intention, but I think that's really key is inclusion, right? Going forward, we need to do better with this and make room for those disparate voices. And one thing I always coach my leaders on, when I talk about interacting with stakeholders, I tell them your job is to make this process pleasant, predictable, and safe for every one of those people who's trusting you with honest feedback and feed forward. And so that's, I think, part of what requires work. That's where a coach can really help a leader show up in a way that is aligned with their intent and that others receive and perceive as trustworthy.
I like that perspective. I want to make sure this is just echoed through the minds of the participants. We can't speak our way to trust. We have to behave our way to trust. And as we've heard, that takes intentionality, that takes scheduling, that takes actually showing up and doing it, as Chris said, consistently, regularly, publicly, and visibly, so that you can be recognized, not just recognized, but acknowledged, people actually feeding back, hey, you are becoming more effective, or I am able to trust you more. So let's hear from Sunil, and then we'll hear from Vijay and move on to the next question. Sunil.
Yeah, thanks, Brendan. Brendan, based on my experience as a corporate leader as well as the coach, I see trust as the most difficult leadership capability, most difficult one. It takes time, like I said, it comes on the foot and goes on the horseback. But what I see is that there is no common barometer or a measure. How do you measure the trust? It's not E is equal to MC square, right? It varies. In every different culture, trust comes in a different way and goes in a different way. And my biggest issue is like Peter Drucker says, culture eats strategy for breakfast. I always make this statement that trust eats leadership for breakfast. It's my version of Peter Drucker. And I also see trust is like a placebo effect. You have the medicine, you get cured. You have a duplicate medicine or dummy medicine, whatever you want to call that, and that's a placebo effect. You still have the trust or need to have the trust. So trust is the most difficult thing in the life of a leadership. And rightly said by Chris, it takes time. It's a consistency. And it's how do you measure it? That's the difficult question for all of us. And all the best to all my HR fraternity, HR leaders to define the KPIs and KRAs for measuring the trust. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sunil. Thank you. And we've got that quote right there in the chat box. Trust eats leadership for breakfast. Vijay, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I'll try to keep it on point. And first I want to say that I agree with my fellow Palinists on that trust is a currency, but it has been there in the past, in the present, as well as in the future. What I do want to say is 3 points about what I think is changing as if you contextualize this for the future, right? The first thing is that I think the expectation of today modern leaders is to be far more vulnerable than they were in the past, to be publicly exposed on a daily basis that they are making mistakes, that it's okay to be, making bad calls on decisions. And they want to see that authenticity in the behavior, as opposed to a very prescribed, conduct of what a leader is perceived to be. I think that builds trust. And so this is something that's playing out in social media as we see it, as leaders are more proactively commenting on a day-to-day basis about whether it's the North Star or whether it's to do with events that shape the company's direction. So that's the first thing to think about. The second thing to think about, that the future is rapidly changing at an accelerated pace. And so for decisions are going to be reversed. Decisions are going to be unwind, unbundled, even if it was made a month or a year ago as part of the strategic plan. So leaders must be able to be vulnerable to navigate and pivot very quickly, far more frequently than they ever have before. And the third piece is something I think I'm observing, which is becoming increasingly true as well, is what I call the spillover effect. The leaders are expected to participate and comment on social issues that's happening around them, which is beyond the sphere of the company. Case in point, if you think on a global level, the conflict in Ukraine, climate action, if you think about social issues in the United States, guns, abortion, diversity as examples, they are expected to participate and show that if you're not making a comment, you're not making a what I call a non-passive positioning, then I can't build trust with you. I want to know where you stand on those issues. So I want to add those elements as part of what I think trust is for the future.
Thank you, Vijay. And while we have you here, I want to dovetail your response just now into questions that we've gotten in various forms in the chat box. But you also spoke on this earlier, which is just how you actually manage people. I want to find the specific question. It came down to, I'll summarize. Again, this came in multiple different ways. We have a pendulum that will swing And when we're working remotely, we have leaders who maybe overextend trust and we move towards a laissez-faire style of leadership. And we have the opposite where trust is more depleted and managers shift more into a micromanagement style where they're managing the people and their time and their tasks and their inputs and their performance and their metrics. How do you effectively manage performance when it's dipping? How do you effectively monitor performance without overstepping the bounds of micromanagement? And Vijay, I'd like to hear your thoughts on this, and Ray, I'll come to you right afterwards. Vijay, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, firstly, I think micromanagement should be eliminated, period. Mm-hmm. I think the whole idea of a leader today is basically to be a cheerleader, a champion, a beacon of hope for the future in the direction of where you want to head and lead the team to. And so it's okay for members of the team to make mistakes. It's okay for them to go over budget occasionally. It's okay for them to make some bad calls. But what is more important is for the mothership is moving in the direction of the North Star. And so for the leaders to basically keeping the eye not on micro actions, but rather on the big North Star in the direction where we're heading, it's far more important. I think there has to be a collective responsibility towards performance. And so performance is not just necessarily an individual ownership. It has to be that we are all in for the same, and the rewards and risks and incentives have to be aligned for the team. And so in that situation, as long as we have an objective for the year, what are the key results and outcomes that you're anticipating from those objectives, measured by key and supporting performance metrics, that is all is needed to really get the team and the organization moving in a certain path.
Thank you. And Ray, I'd love to come to you also as a business leader, as a manager. What is your opinion on this?
I have to completely agree with Vijay here. I think clarity of vision is very important. If I were to ask everybody here, right, my fellow panelists to go on a run with me tomorrow, right? How many of you guys would say yes? Probably some of you guys would say yes because, okay, he seems like a decent guy, right? Vijay put up his hand, okay, Vijay's going to come on a run with me. But, and we start running, there will come a point where you guys are going to start questioning, oh my God, where's this guy going? Right? Where's he running to, right? And if I keep saying, oh, don't worry, right? I'll get you to the end. Just keep on running, right? Eventually, people will drop off. And that's the same with our companies, right? That's the same with our businesses. We expect everybody to run with us in the same line and follow us wherever we go, but we don't provide the direction. We don't provide the finish line. And if I change the whole narrative and I told every one of you guys, hey guys, tomorrow we're going to run 5 kilometers. We're going to start here. We're going to end there. And at the end of the line, I'm gonna share with you the best, the best banana leaf rice. It's really, really nice here in Malaysia. The best food that you can ever taste. And those that want to run and taste the food will run. And those that don't want to run, they can make a decision there and then not to run, and we don't have to waste each other's time. So I think providing that direction and removing micromanagement, because we've got to understand that especially the younger generations that's coming to work, they all grew up with the internet. I was just having a conversation with a cousin of mine who's a doctor, and he says to me, right, everyone that comes to see him in his doctor's office already comes with a diagnosis already. Hey, doctor, I think I have this and this and this, right? And he said, like, who's the doctor here? So I think everybody is coming to the workforce having already some form of knowledge, a lot of knowledge. So we've got to provide that whole basis of enhancing their learning, giving them the empowerment that they letting them make mistakes, like what Vijay says. And it's a learning journey, right? We can't micromanage. It just doesn't work anymore. We're not in the 20s or the 30s anymore.
Thank you, Ray. And anyone who wants to show up at 9 11:08 tomorrow in the morning for the run. We'll see you there.
I'll see you there.
Kimberly, your thoughts.
Yeah, thank you. Just building on what both Vijay and Ray spoke to, it makes me think of the need for, yes, vision, right? And what leaders have to do is set a vision and articulate a plan and clear goals and expectations for getting there. But we all know that between mapping point A in the journey and where it ends at point B, there's a lot of stuff that's going to happen that we're going to have to deal with real time. And so for me, I like to ask my leaders to be aware on that balance of, you know, kindness, which empathy, huge, right? We know the research, Google has spent a lot of time looking at this. Empathy is huge. To me, that's understanding your needs. If you're someone on my team, I want to be clear about that. But I also need to have firmness, right? I need structure. I need accountability. We need that if we're going to go far together. And so I ask leaders to think about, you know, what are the behaviors, what are the triggers or the external stimulus, or even your own internal experience that pushes you from, you know, perhaps the empathy side and swings you over to coming down hard to that micromanagement. And I think awareness of that can help rather than a teeter-totter where we go back and forth. I think it's important to look for kind and firm at the same time. So I'm aware of your needs. I have an understanding of the needs of the situation, and I'm actually optimizing for both. So I have clear structure, I have accountability, and as a number of people have mentioned, I lead with curiosity. Help me understand what's going on for you. I notice there's a gap here. How can I help? What do you need? Trusting people, right? You've hired smart people. If you can't trust them, you have a problem with your hiring process. But more than that, trusting people to learn from mistakes. That's how it goes. And how do we not repeat the same mistakes together over and over?
Thank you, Kimberly. And ladies and gentlemen, I want to point out that we are nearing the top of our time. I want to get through a couple more questions. And I want to start off with this. We've had a wonderful question in the chat box, and I'm going to invite all our panelists to go to your chat box and type in a response to this. And I want to use this for our closing. We had a number of questions about best practices or what you should, if we were to make a short list of here's one tip for you to take away, and we can make this into a short list for all our participants, here's 5 things that you can start doing now. What is one tip, panelists? One tip for best practices for remote leadership. If you had one tip to tell everybody in the panel, panelists, please go to your chat box and share this with everybody. And while you're typing, I want to point out one question that came out from Rajiv Nayak. His question was in certain, I'm gonna respond to this while our panelists are typing. In certain cultures, especially Asian and Eastern European cultures, stakeholders may not be very open in providing feed forward. And part of this has to do with that high power distant culture. What is our view on cultural nuance? And I want to respond to this while our panelists are typing from the perspective of a researcher who has done very in-depth studies on stakeholder-centered coaching around the world. Some of these projects are in progress. Some of them have been submitted academically with further reports, but have not been publicly released. And the strange thing is, stakeholder-centered coaching works very well in high-power distant cultures. It has a slower start, and that's the caveat. It takes some time, as Chris mentioned, to slowly build trust, because when you are in one of these cultures and you say, hey, direct report, I want you to tell me how to be a better leader, they think, what? What a weird thing for you to ask. And it takes that consistency of saying, I really want your opinion. Your opinion's important to me. Your perspective is important to me. Share this with me. Over time, this blossoms into real, genuine feedback that when it's done, has a very strong immediate impact on the leader. And we see this in high power distant cultures more than others. Now, from an outcomes perspective, there are marginal, non-statistically significant differences amongst these cultures, But the critical factor is there are not major differences based on the region in which they lie. Now, there may be exogenous or endogenous factors that have not been fully fleshed out yet, but I want to encourage you that the concept of feed forward holds true when there is a great deal of consistency and regularity. As we've heard from several of our panelists, intentionality is really important. So it will continue to work. Ladies and gentlemen, turn your attention to the chat box. Let's see what our panelists have put in here. One of them is maintaining work-life balance. From Sunil, we've heard from David, and some of these may have just come to my chat. From David, we got be your authentic self and understand the authenticity of others. Ray shared predictability in rhythms. I think that's such a powerful collocation, predictability in rhythms. If our teams are able to understand what they are required to work within, then they don't need to be micromanaged. So setting up the structures, letting people follow them, and then manage those outcomes of did you do this or not. Trust is built, this is from Fiona, but we'll share it anyway. Trust is built by what you do, not what you say. That was an echo from what Kimberly earlier shared. We have from Chris, social media data is not information, information is not knowledge, and knowledge is not wisdom. Wow, that was a roller coaster. One more time, social media is not information, information is not knowledge, and knowledge is not wisdom. Very powerful stuff. So we have gotten a number of questions from you, ladies and gentlemen. We have done our very best to answer as many of these as possible. Those that have not gotten a response so far, we will be combing back through the Q&A. We'll be combing back through the chat and making sure that all of you get answers, get responses to your questions. So continue to drop these in. We'll continue to respond to them. Let me turn to Kimberly, who put in her one tip. First, be human. That's so simple and so powerful. Be human. Start with care and empathy. Be open to learn together. Ritualize the behaviors and practices that keep you grounded and centered on your purpose and vision. Be human, be empathetic, ritualize your behaviors, especially those that keep you grounded and connected to your center and to your purpose and to your vision. So with that, we have a number of questions we'll continue to respond to, but I want to first thank our panelists for being here. Thank you, all of you panelists, for being here and showing up in your chat box, ladies and gentlemen. You can share gratitude if you feel so compelled. Thank you for being here and sharing your insights. Participants and attendees, thank you for being present today. We will be at the end of this session and in the coming weeks responding to the questions that have come through, following up with materials. And in the meantime, Julian, if people have questions, let's put that link in the chat box. If you have more questions, or if you think of a question after this session, if tonight you're trying to sleep and you wake up and think, I should have asked this, you can send this to contact@mgscc.net. I'm going to put this in the chat. It may disappear. Contact@mgscc.net. We've got 3 instances. If you have questions, please send them there. Otherwise, thank you for your attendance today. Thank you for being present. Feel free to let us know your thoughts on the session, on any additional questions. And until next time, this has been Stakeholder Centered Coaching. I've been your host, Brandon Mergard. It has been a pleasure. And with that, I bid you all adieu. Thank you and enjoy the rest of your day, night, or evening. Goodbye, everybody.
Thank you, Ben.